I want to embark on a series of videos which I'll entitle Why Yeshua Spoke in Parables. Originally, I intended to make this series a continuation of Yeshua Revisited at the end of March of this year. But because of circumstances beyond my control, this second series was delayed until now. However, before looking at the parables of Yeshua, I think it is important to look at the way parables were used in the Hebrew Scriptures. That will help us to see the background and the reasons why Yeshua used that genre when he was speaking. In the Hebrew language, the parables are referred to as mashalim, but I will continue referring to them as parables rather than mashalim, as most people today know them simply as parables. The words spoken by the prophets were given to them through Yahweh Zevaot, who we now know, of course, as Yeshua, and why on many occasions he gave the visions to the prophets, and also the messages there were found in the parable form. That the parables used in Scripture are often defined as being a short allegorical or moral narrative, using either animal characters or other non-human symbols to reflect the actions of people and nations. Joseph Sha'ul, a messianic teacher in Israel, competently describes the use of parables in the Hebrew Scriptures. So I'll paraphrase his words on this matter. Every parable has some kind of secret in it. Otherwise, there would have been no need to speak in the parable. The parable is a short, pithy, and sometimes humorous story that tells us things that cannot be spoken openly because of political, moral, or security reasons. So instead of the named person being spoken about, the narrator uses animals, trees, and other natural characters in the stories. The implied message could not be stated openly because of the political and moral character, meaning that it would be too dangerous for the speaker to have spoken out directly. End of quote. So with that explanation in mind, I will consider three examples which we found in Judges chapter 9, 2 Samuel chapter 12, along with the one in Isaiah. In each example, we will see how Yahweh Zevaot sent a strong message to either an individual or group of people who are at the center of the narrative. Starting with the narrative in Judges chapter 9, in verses 1 through 21, the narrative begins with the death of Gideon, one of Yahweh's most prominent judges. But when Gideon died, Israel rapidly reverted back to Baal Berit, the Lord of the covenant, being their God. And they yet again forgot the saving power of Yahweh and showed no kindness towards the family of Gideon. Abimelech, the son of Gideon, by a concubine or slave girl, stood up among the men of Shechem, offering himself as their king. He offered himself as an alternative to the leadership of the 70 other legitimate sons of Gideon. Hence, the men of Shechem accepted him as their king and erroneously said, "After all, he is our brother," but ignoring the fact that he was an illegitimate half-brother. So the men of Shechem made Abimelech their king. Having won support of the men of Shechem, he returned to his father's house, slaughtered 69 of the 70 half-brothers. So he removed all legitimate opposition to his kingship. But the youngest son of Gideon, named Yotam, managed to hide and escape death. He became an immediate threat to the kingship of Abimelech. But how could he stand up for his rightful place as the real heir apparent? He knew that if he spoke up and denounced Abimelech, he would be killed instantly. So he went out and stood on the top of Mount Gerizim and shouted the parable to the men of Shechem down in the valley below. In verses 17 through 15, Yotam told the men of Shechem this parable. His words were about trees, having to select from among themselves one tree that would rule over all the other trees. Firstly, the trees called on the olive to rule, but it declined. Next, they invited the fig, but it also declined. So the trees turned to the grapevine, but it also declined. Finally, in desperation, all the trees turned to the thorn bush, saying in verse 14, "You come and rule over us." The thorn bush was the only one that stepped up for the role of leadership. Then in verse 15, the thorn bush says, "If you really make me king over you, then come and take shelter in my shade. But if not, let fire come out from the thorn bush and burn down the cedars of the Lebanon." Having concluded the parable, Yotam then explains the meaning by first posing a question to the men of Shechem by saying, "Have you been honest and straightforward in making Abimelech your king?" Yotam then went on to explain to the men of Shechem the gravity of what they had done by electing Abimelech, the thorn bush, to be their king. Yotam reminds them that Abimelech was an illegitimate son of a slave girl, unlike Yotam and his brothers, the ones that Abimelech had killed. Yotam went on to remind the audience that if they thought they were dealing honestly with the family of Gideon, they needed to think again. Then in verses 19 and 20, he poses another direct challenge about the pending kingship of Abimelech by saying, "If you are dealing honestly and righteously with Gideon and his household, but if not, let the fire come out from Abimelech and burn up the men of Shechem and burn up Abimelech." Having laid before them the consequences of selecting a fruitless tree as their king, he was laying bare the stupidity of their choice. But realizing the gravity of what he had laid before them, he fled the town in fear of Abimelech. The whole saga continues and concludes in verses 56 to 57 with the words, "This is how God paid back Abimelech for the wrong that he did to his father in murdering his 70 brothers. God also repaid the men of Shechem for all the wrong that they had done." So turning next to the example in 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12, we read about the lustful actions of King David and how, when he realized that Bathsheba had become pregnant, he sent her husband to the front line of the war and had him killed. Against that background, we see in chapter 12, verse 1 to 4, where Yahweh calls upon Nathan, the court prophet, to challenge David over the outcome of his lustful encounter with Bathsheba. Nathan, however, realized that if he delivered that message from Yahweh directly to the king in a straightforward manner and using simple words, David would most likely have killed Nathan on the spot. Hence, Nathan couched his words in the form of a parable. David responded with an explosive anger without realizing he himself was the actual subject of the parable. In response, he said, "As Yahweh lives, the man who did this deserves to die." But what was the outcome? Nathan said, "You are the man in the parable," and then qualified his words by adding verses 8 to 9. "Here is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you as king over Israel. I rescued you from the power of Sha'ul. I gave you the house of Israel and the house of Yehudah. So why have you shown such contempt for the words of Yahweh and done what I see as evil?" David, having realized the severity of his actions, turned to Nathan and admitted openly, "I have sinned against Yahweh." Then, the rest of that chapter, we read how Yahweh spared the life of David, but confronted him with three choices as to how he could atone for his past actions. The point I'm focusing on is that to get his message through to David, Nathan had to couch his rebuke of the king in language that did not result in his own immediate death. He had to use the parable as a literary vehicle that would make David think deeply without accusing David directly. Finally, our third example is in Yeshayahu. Isaiah chapter 28, verses 1 to 6 and 23 to 29. This is the one, this third one perhaps is the closest in character to the way that Yeshua spoke to the people of Galilee. Firstly, in verse 1, Yahweh is expressing his disdain towards the king of the 10 tribes. Yahweh, through Yeshayahu, speaks again in a parable form by saying, "Woe to the haughty crown of Ephraim's drunks." Here, Yeshayahu is using the words to impart a strong message without inflaming the recipients to the point of uncontrollable anger. He was showing through the parable that Yahweh was greatly displeased with the leaders of Ephraim. By using that parable to deliver his message, Yeshayahu avoided certain anger on the part of the audience, which would have likely ended in his own death. However, in verse 2, he prophesies in relatively plain language by saying, Yahweh has someone strong and powerful. He comes like a hailstorm, a destructive tempest, like a flood of water, rushing, overwhelming. With his hand, he hurls them to the ground. In that verse, Yeshayahu is preparing the king of Ephraim and the 10 northern tribes of Israel about their pending fate. Then, if we jump to verses 23 to 29 of chapter 28, we see the voice of Yahweh speaking again through Yeshayahu and again in the form of a parable, where he is using the words that are very similar to the words spoken by Yeshua in many of his parables. Here, the prophet is using various stages of a farming cycle to look at a series of events that will occur far into the future. None of Yeshayahu's audience would have any concept of the time period about which the prophet was speaking. So I want to take a few minutes to consider the words of Yeshayahu's farming parable and look at it in relation to what we know was actually happening in the time of Yeshua's earthly ministry, and what, of course, will happen in the future. In verses 23 and 24, Yahweh says, "Listen and hear my voice. Pay attention and hear what I'm saying. Does a farmer keep ploughing forever? Does he never stop breaking up and harrowing the land? No," is the answer. Having answered his own question about the ploughing, Yahweh shows that the ploughing stops before the sowing begins. As we now know, the coming of Yeshua ben Yosef saw the end of the ploughing process. He moved Israel on from that ploughing stage to the second farming phase, mentioned in verses 25 and 26, where throughout his earthly ministry he started the planting process. Again, the types of seed planted reflected various callings that were extended to those who heard his message. Moving on to verses 27 and 28, we see two forms of harvest. Firstly, in verse 27, we see the processing of dill and cumin. The dill had to be beaten with a stick and the cumin with a flail. I believe we are there seeing what is happening to the first 12 emissaries and the future Kohanim following the upward call at some stage in the future. That will be the first resurrection, which I spoke about last week, where, following Yom Teruah, there will be a period of 10 days of testing of one's works, as spoken about by Sha'ul, before atonement on Yom Kippur, and of course the consummation of Yeshua's bride. So returning to Yeshayahu chapter 28, in verse 28, we see that he is there speaking about the processing of grain for bread. There, he says, when crushing the grain for bread, one doesn't thresh it forever. One drives the horse and cart wheels over it, but it does not crush it to powder. Those are powerful words, but to the audience whom Yeshayahu was speaking, his words would have had no meaning at all. So we can see, by using parables, Yahweh was concealing the depth of his message until the right time when it will be made known. Many things that were spoken through the prophets of old, and also many of the words of Yeshua himself, will remain concealed until the Olam Haba, the age to come. Then people of the second resurrection will be confronted with the teachings of Yeshua, particularly through the words of Torah, and also all the things that were said to the prophets will be revealed in clear and simple language that they will all understand. So returning to the 3 example parables we've considered, you may have noticed there is a significant difference between the first 2 parables and the third one. The first 2 were all about events that were happening at the time the narrator was giving his speech. So in both cases, the meaning of the parable was explained to them in simple language. However, in the third example, in Yeshayahu Isaiah, the words about the farming parable were not explained. The reason why that parable remains unexplained was because the focal point of that parable was far into the future. Yeshayahu was speaking about things that were destined to occur at the time of Yeshua's earthly ministry and also later in the age to come, or the Olam Haba. Therefore, there was no need for any explanation to be given. That is why only during the Olam Haba will the full significance of that third type of parable be made known to all who have part in that second resurrection, which will be the greater part of mankind. The same applies to most parables spoken by Yeshua. The underlying reason Yeshua avoided giving explanations to most of his parables is because he knew that the religious establishment would take advantage of any new information that would indicate who he really was. He did not want to allow them, the authorities, to gain knowledge about the future. Further, if they had understood fully what he was saying, they would have had him arrested and executed well before the required date of the 14th of Aviv in 30 CE. Yeshua had laid down his message about the future of Israel and all mankind without bringing about an untimely early execution. As we now have the book of Revelation, we have a much better appreciation of what lies ahead. But the religious establishment of both the 1st and the 21st centuries, because they have rejected the words of Yeshua and the prophets, are still being kept in the dark about the timing in God's sovereign plan. Only during Yeshua's reign of restoration will all he said be known and the full significance of the parables, both in the Tanakh and the ones that Yeshua spoke, be fully understood. Only then will all Israel understand the full meaning of his words and be able to share the full message with the Goyim, the nations. Just as Yeshua himself said in Mattityahu, or Matthew chapter 24, verse 14. And the good news about the kingdom will be announced throughout the world as a witness to all the Goyim, and then the end will come. Shabbat Shalom.